He had crushed men who dared cross him. He had built an empire on silence and fear. Kang Min-jae was not a man who cried. Not ever. But standing in a hospital hallway, pressing his back against a cold white wall, listening to his own mother laugh about the woman sleeping behind that door, the woman who had been eating alone every single night he was gone, smiling on video calls so he wouldn't worry, something cracked open inside his chest that no bullet had ever managed to reach. If you've ever loved someone who suffered in silence to protect you, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The call came at 2:47 in the morning. Min-jae was in Tokyo, sitting at a low table inside a private dining room on the 34th floor of a building that didn't appear on any public directory. The men across from him, two senior representatives from the Yamamoto network, and one old ghost from Osaka who still wore his suits tailored like it was 1989, had been negotiating for 6 hours. The air smelled like cold green tea and cigarette smoke, and the particular kind of tension that meant someone was close to walking away from the table. His phone buzzed once against the lacquered wood. He didn't look at it. It buzzed again. The Osaka man raised an eyebrow. Min-jae's chief of security, a broad-shouldered man named Do Sung-woo, who had served him for 11 years without ever once raising his voice in public, leaned down and whispered 4 words directly into his ear. Min-jae looked at the phone. He stood up. "We'll reschedule," he said, and left the room without explaining. The Yamamoto representatives exchanged glances. The Osaka man just reached for his tea. Nobody asked Kang Min-jae to explain himself twice. On the helicopter to Haneda, Sung-woo told him everything the hospital had reported. Nia had collapsed in the main hallway of the mansion near the staircase. One of the housekeepers, a young woman named Seo Yeon, who had worked in the household for 8 months, had found her and called emergency services before contacting the family. The doctor on intake had mentioned a word, a specific word, the kind of word that rewires the brain on contact. Min-jae stared out the window at Tokyo's lights spreading beneath him like scattered glass. "How long?" he said. "Has she been hiding it?" Sung-woo didn't answer immediately. That pause told Min-jae everything he needed to know about who else in the household had failed to tell him something. "We'll talk about that later," Min-jae said quietly. "Get the plane ready." He did not sleep on the flight to Seoul. He sat with his hands resting flat on the armrests and stared at a fixed point somewhere above the seat in front of him and did not speak for 4 hours. The 2 men traveling with him knew better than to try. Nia Brooks was not supposed to be the kind of woman who ended up in his life. He knew that. He had always known that. She had come into his world sideways, through a charity auction in Chicago 6 years ago where Min-jae had been attending under a cover identity that his lawyers had spent considerable money constructing. She had outbid him for a set of ceramic bowls made by a 90-year-old artist from Oaxaca, looked directly at him afterward, and said, "You waited too long. If you want something, you have to commit." She hadn't known who he was. That was the thing that undid him completely. Every woman who had entered his life before Nia had known exactly who he was before they ever looked at him directly. They came pre-adjusted, precautious, pre-shaped around the reality of what he was. Nia had just looked at him like he was a man who had lost a bidding war and needed to learn from it. He'd asked her to dinner. She said she was busy Thursday. He said Friday. She said maybe Saturday, but she had to check. He had run criminal networks across 3 countries. He had sat across from men who would have put a knife in his back if they thought for 1 second they could get away with it. He had negotiated in rooms where the wrong word meant someone didn't walk out. And he had stood on a sidewalk in Chicago, watching a woman in a yellow coat walk away from him without looking back, and felt something he hadn't felt since he was a child. The sick, helpless certainty that something mattered and he couldn't control it. Saturday worked. They got dinner. Then another dinner. Then somewhere in the space of 8 months, she was inside his life in a way he hadn't planned for and couldn't reverse. And the truth is, he didn't want to. She married him knowing the shape of his world. She didn't pretend it was something else. She just said, "I'm not marrying your empire, I'm marrying you. Don't make me regret the distinction." He had promised her she wouldn't. The taxi from Incheon moved through pre-dawn Seoul, and Min-jae sat in the back with his phone dark in his pocket, and tried to remember the last time he'd heard her voice sound worried about anything other than him. He couldn't. The hospital was one of those private facilities in Gangnam that looked more like a boutique hotel than a medical building from the outside. White stone, curved glass, a lobby that smelled faintly of eucalyptus. The kind of place that cost enough that silence was part of what you were paying for. His mother was already there. Madame Kang Yon-hee stood near the elevator bank in a cream wool coat, her posture the way it always was. Spine like a measuring rod, hands folded, expression arranged into something that communicated concern without revealing anything beneath it. His older sister Jisoo stood beside her in gray, arms crossed loosely, mouth set in a line. Min-jae crossed the lobby. His mother touched his arm. "She's stable," Yeon-hee said, "but the surgery went well. She's sleeping." "What surgery?" He hadn't been told about surgery. The flight information had said observation, a brief pause between his mother and his sister, almost invisible. He catalogued it without comment. "There were complications," Jisoo said. "The doctors decided to move quickly. It was the right call." "Which doctor made that call?" "Dr. Park." "He's excellent, Min-jae. He trained at Johns Hopkins." Min-jae looked at her for a moment. "I want to speak to him." "It's nearly 5 in the morning. I understand what time it is." Jisoo pressed her lips together but didn't argue. She pulled out her phone. He went to find the nurse's station himself. The floor Nia was on had the kind of controlled quiet that hospitals achieve at that hour. The hum of machines somewhere behind closed doors. The soft click of a keyboard. Someone's rubber soles squeaking briefly on polished floor before the sound faded. Min-jae moved through it without asking anyone to announce him. He knew the room number. Sung-woo had confirmed it twice on the drive over. He stopped in the corridor outside her room because the door was partially open and he could hear voices. His mother had followed him up. He hadn't heard the elevator, hadn't heard footsteps. But there she was, 10 feet behind him, and there was Jisoo beside her, and the two of them had stopped just inside the hallway's bend, without realizing he was already standing there in the shadow near the window alcove. He didn't move. He should have made his presence known. He knew that. But some old instinct honed over years of listening to what people said when they thought no one dangerous was nearby, kept him very still. The voices coming from inside the room were his mother and his sister. They'd already been inside. They'd left and come back, or they'd simply been in there while he was at the nurse's station. He couldn't tell. But they were talking, and the door was open by perhaps 4 inches, and sound carries differently at 5 in the morning when everything else is silent. "She looked terrible," Jisoo said, low and almost bored. "That's what the stress does. She doesn't belong in this kind of life. She never did." "Min-jae made his choice," Yeon-hee said, "but that doesn't mean we have to pretend the choice was a good one." She was at the table alone again at Chuseok. "Did you notice? Just sitting there waiting for someone to include her?" "I noticed." She kept passing dishes to people who weren't looking at her. A pause. Then, from his mother, something that might have been a small laugh, or the sound someone makes when they find something absurd rather than funny. "She tries so hard. It would almost be touching if it weren't so exhausting." Min-jae's jaw tightened. He pressed his back against the wall. "She called me in October," Jisoo continued. "Did I tell you that? She called me and asked if there was something she had done, something she could fix. I didn't answer." "Good." She left a message, a very polite message. Said she hoped they could talk when I had time. Another pause. "I deleted it." "The staff that kept coddling her are gone," Yeon-hee said. "That girl, the one who used to bring her tea without being asked. Seo-yeon. Gone. I made sure of it." Min-jae was aware of his own breathing. He was controlling it very precisely, the way he did in rooms where control was the only thing keeping a situation from collapse. In, hold, out, slow. "She doesn't complain to him," Jisoo said. There was something almost like surprise in it. "No." His mother's voice dropped slightly. "She doesn't. I'll give her that much. She's protecting him, I think. She knows what it would do to him to know. That's either very noble or very stupid. It doesn't matter which. She won't last. Not in this family. Not really." Then from inside the room, a sound. A voice. Hoarse from sleep or from whatever the surgery had taken out of her. Quiet, but audible. Nia's voice. "I know you're there." Silence from his mother and sister. "I've been awake for a few minutes," Nia said. Her voice was steady but thin, like a wire pulled close to its limit. "You don't have to stop." Another silence. Then, "You should rest," Yeon-hee said, in the register of someone remembering at the last second to apply a veneer. "I've been resting for a while," Nia said. "I have time." A pause. "I heard what you said about Seo-yeon." No response. "She was good at her job. She was kind to me when She was just kind. That's all she did. The household staff report to me when Min Jae is abroad, Yeonhee said, and her voice had returned to its normal temperature, which was somewhere below room. That is how it has always been. I know, Naya said. I know that. Another pause. Min Jae heard something in that pause that he couldn't name. A kind of resignation so practiced it had become structural, like load-bearing walls that had been installed before anyone thought to ask whether the house was worth keeping. I'm not going to ask you to like me, Naya said finally. I figured that out a while ago. I want you to know that I'm not trying to take anything from you. I never was. I just love him. That's the only thing I've ever been trying to do here. No response from either of them. He doesn't know, Naya said, and now her voice had shifted into something lower, more careful, like she was carrying something fragile in both hands. And I need him not to know, because if he finds out, he doesn't know how to handle things like this without. She stopped, took a breath. He'll destroy everything, and I can't be the reason for that. I can't be the reason he loses his family. Silence from the room. Then the sound of 2 pairs of feet, and the door swung slightly further open, and Min Jae had 2 seconds to make a decision. He turned and moved back down the corridor toward the window alcove before either of them came out. He stood with his face toward the glass, appearing to look at the gray pre-dawn soul spread below, as his mother and his sister walked past him without stopping. His mother paused for 1/2 second. She's awake, Yeonhee said. You can go in. Thank you, Min Jae said. He waited until he heard the elevator doors close, then he turned around. He put his hand flat against the cold window glass. The city below was beginning its first gray exhale before sunrise. Delivery trucks on silent streets, the orange-white blur of a signal light cycling through nobody. He stood there for a long time. He was 41 years old. He had been in this life since he was 19, picked up by his uncle after his father's debts caught up with the family in a way that men who owe the wrong people understand viscerally. He had built what he had by being harder than whatever was in front of him. He had looked men in the eye while they understood he was taking everything from them. He had made decisions in the space of 3 seconds that other men couldn't unmake for years. He had always believed, had organized his entire understanding of himself around the belief, that what he provided was protection. He had been wrong. He hadn't been protecting her. He had been across the Pacific asking men from Osaka whether they wanted to move product through ports he controlled, while the woman who asked only that he come home safe sat alone at a holiday table passing dishes to people who refused to look at her, while his mother dismissed the people who were kind to her, while his sister deleted her calls. He had given her a mansion and an empire's edge and a life of material comfort so elaborate it might have looked from the outside like everything. He had given her nothing she actually needed. The tears, when they came, were not the kind that announced themselves. They were the kind that arrived silently, like water finding the crack in a foundation. Not a collapse, not a breaking down, but the quiet proof that something had been wrong for much longer than anyone had admitted. He pressed his hand harder against the glass. He thought about her voice, that careful, exhausted voice saying, I can't be the reason he loses his family. And he understood, maybe for the first time, what kind of love that actually was. Not the love of someone who needed him to be powerful, the love of someone who was willing to suffer so that he didn't have to choose. He wiped his face with the back of his hand, straightened his jacket, breathed. Then he walked to her door, knocked softly once, and pushed it open. She was lying with the bed raised slightly, her face pale against the pillow, the hospital bracelet visible on her wrist. She turned her head when she heard him, and something crossed her expression. Relief, then worry, then the practice smoothing over that he now understood she had been performing for years. Hey, she said softly, you came home. Of course I came home. He crossed the room and pulled the chair close to the bed and sat down. He took her hand carefully, aware of the IV, and held it. How are you feeling? He said. Better. The doctor said the surgery was clean. A pause. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. I didn't want you to. Don't, he said. Not harshly, just quietly. A closed door. She looked at him, really looked, the way she always did, the way that had undone him on a sidewalk in Chicago 6 years ago and had never stopped. Min Jae, are you okay? He looked at her face, at the tiredness in it, at the way she was already, even now, asking about him. No, he said. For the first time in longer than he could remember, He said the honest thing to the only person who had ever asked without needing him to pretend otherwise. "No, I'm not." She didn't ask him to explain. She just tightened her fingers around his. He stayed. Outside, Seoul turned from gray to pale gold. An hour passed, then two. Min-jae sat without moving, holding his wife's hand while she drifted back into sleep, and in the silence of that hospital room he began, very quietly, to understand what he was going to do next. Whatever it cost. Whatever it took. He was not going to sit across the table from her suffering for one more night and call it enough. But what he discovered when Sung-woo delivered the first set of security footage to his private tablet, footage Min-jae had requested before he left the hallway in those few silent minutes before he walked through her door, what he saw on that screen would change the shape of everything he thought he had understood about his own house. And there was someone in that footage he had never expected to see. The footage came in 4 separate drives. Sung-woo delivered them personally, without being asked twice, which told Min-jae something about how long his chief of security had been sitting on the knowledge that something in that house was wrong. Sung-woo set the drives on the desk in Min-jae's private office, the one inside the hospital's executive suite that Min-jae had arranged to use while Nia remained under observation, and stood with his hands behind his back and his eyes somewhere between the desk and the window, which was the posture of a man waiting to be punished for something he'd done or failed to do. Min-jae looked at him for a long moment. "How much of this did you know?" he said. "I knew the house had tension," Sung-woo said. "I didn't know the scope." Tension. Min-jae repeated the word the way you repeat something when you want the person who said it to hear how small it sounds. Sung-woo didn't flinch. He was not the kind of man who flinched, but his jaw moved slightly, and he said, "I failed to escalate what I should have escalated. I won't make an excuse for that." Min-jae looked at him for another second, then looked at the drives. "Get me a laptop, get coffee, and close the door on your way out." He started with the oldest footage. The archive system in the Kang mansion had been installed 4 years ago at Min-jae's own instruction, an overlapping grid of cameras covering every common area, every corridor, every entrance and exit point, triggered by motion and backed up automatically to an encrypted server. It was a security measure. He had designed it to protect his household from threats that came from outside. He had never considered what it might document from within. The first file was dated 14 months ago. A Tuesday evening in late autumn, 6:48 p.m. The grand dining room shot from the upper corner near the ceiling, the camera half hidden in the carved molding the way they all were. The table was set for 8, candles. Good porcelain, the kind of arrangement that photographs well and means nothing. Nia was already seated when his mother came in. She stood when Yeon-hee entered the way she always did, the small, polite gesture she had adopted early in the marriage and never stopped performing. She said something. He couldn't read her lips perfectly, but the shape was something like "good evening." She was wearing a dark green dress. Her hair was up. Yeon-hee walked past her without acknowledgement. Not a glance. Not a pause. The way you walk past furniture. Nia sat back down. His sister arrived with her husband 2 minutes later. Jisoo spoke to Yeon-hee, touched her arm, took a seat 3 chairs down from Nia without making eye contact. Jisoo's husband, a man named Taewon, who managed 3 of the family's legitimate import businesses and had the handshake of a man permanently auditioning for a role he'd already been given, looked at Nia once and then away, and that was the complete extent of it. 3 other family members arrived. Cousins. An uncle. Each one performed the same invisible erasure, the social mechanics of exclusion that require no overt cruelty because the cruelty is entirely in the omission. Nia sat at that table for 47 minutes. Min-jae watched the timestamp. 47 minutes of reaching for dishes, of pouring her own water, of attempting, twice, to address a comment to his sister, who responded with monosyllables and turned back to Yeon-hee. At minute 31, one of the household staff brought out a dish, and Nia was the only person at the table who thanked him by name. At minute 47, she excused herself. No one looked up. She walked out of the frame, and the dining room continued without her, and the candles kept burning, and Min-jae sat in the hospital executive suite and watched the empty chair where his wife had been sitting and felt something move through him that wasn't anger yet. It was the thing that comes before anger, when you are a man who has learned to wait for the right temperature before you act. It was a cold, clarifying recognition, the kind that doesn't leave. He switched to the next file, and the next. He watched for 6 hours. He watched Nia spend a lunar New Year's Eve in the library while the family gathered in the main hall 40 feet away. He watched a housekeeper, Park Seo-yeon, young, efficient, the one his mother had eventually dismissed. Bring Nia a plate of food and sit with her for 20 minutes. The two of them talking quietly while the sounds of celebration moved through the walls. He watched his sister take a call in the kitchen while Nia stood 2 feet away trying to show her something on a phone. A photo, he thought, maybe something she'd wanted to share. And Jisoo held up one finger, took her call, and walked out of the room without ever acknowledging what Nia had been trying to show her. He watched Nia stand in the main foyer on a Saturday afternoon, dressed nicely, clearly ready to go somewhere. And he watched his mother come down the staircase, see her, and without breaking stride say something brief and go to the sitting room. Nia stood in the foyer for another minute. Then she went upstairs and didn't come back down. He watched a video call, this one pulled from a different archive, the internal communication system, where Nia was on the phone with him. He was somewhere in Hong Kong. He recognized the hotel suite. He watched himself on the small screen within screen, laughing at something, asking if she'd eaten, saying the meetings were brutal but he'd be back by Thursday. He watched Nia tell him she was fine, that the house was quiet, that she'd been doing some reading. She was smiling. The smile was real enough that he hadn't questioned it. The smile was real enough that he had ended the call feeling better about being away. She had eaten alone 3 nights in a row before that call. He saw the kitchen logs, staff records, 1 plate, 1 setting. He closed the laptop. He sat in the executive suite with his hands flat on the desk and stared at the surface of the wood and breathed very deliberately for about 2 minutes. The coffee Sungwoo had brought was cold. He didn't touch it. Then he opened the laptop again, because he needed to see all of it. He needed to see everything. Running from the full weight of something had never once served him well, and he wasn't going to start now. The jewelry was documented in a staff inventory report that Sungwoo had pulled separately, a cross-reference between the household insurance records and the current contents of the master bedroom's secondary safe. 4 pieces missing. A bracelet Min Jae had brought back from Bangkok 2 years ago. A necklace he'd had made for their 3rd anniversary. 2 rings she'd kept in the safe rather than wearing, because she'd told him she was afraid of losing them, and he'd thought that was something people said when they loved something. The inventory discrepancy had been flagged by the household accountant 8 months ago. The report had been forwarded to his mother's administrative contact. It had never reached Min Jae. He found the family portraits in a separate file, photographs from the official Kang family archives, the kind that got framed and placed in hallways, and sent to the family's charitable foundation for their donor newsletters. In 3 of the 5 most recent official portraits, Nia had been cropped out or composited over. In the foundation newsletter from last spring, the caption beneath a family photograph read the Kang family at their annual charity gala, and the woman standing beside Min Jae in the original had been replaced with empty space, or rather with the kind of careful visual editing that assumes no one will check the original. Min Jae pulled up the original. He looked at it for a long time. Nia was wearing a burgundy dress. She was looking slightly to her left toward him, and she was almost but not quite smiling. That particular expression she had when she was happy, but trying not to look like she was showing off about it. Then he called Sungwoo back into the room. Sungwoo came in, read the room in about 1 second the way he always did, and stood. "My mother's personal assistant," Min Jae said, "the woman who handles her household correspondence." "Ms. Oh." She cleared the jewelry inventory report. Sungwoo was quiet for a moment. "Yes." She was acting on instruction. Another pause. "That would be my assessment." Min Jae nodded slowly. "And the portraits?" "The Foundation's communications manager handles those. He reports to the Foundation board chair." "Who is?" "Your mother," Sungwoo said. Min Jae sat back in the chair. He pressed 2 fingers against the bridge of his nose. "The girl, Theo Yan, the one who was dismissed. She was given a reference letter and 3-month severance. She's working at a hotel in Mapo now, front desk. Get me her number." Sungwoo wrote it on a card and put it on the desk. "One more thing," Min Jae said. "My sister's husband, Taewon. His position in the Busan import operation. What's his contract structure?" Sungwoo's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes understood where this was going. "Direct appointment through the family trust. Renewable annually. Your signature required for continuation." "When does it come up for renewal?" 6 weeks. Min Jae looked at the card with Seo-yeon's number. "Good," he said. "That's all for now." He called the number that afternoon. She picked up on the 3rd ring, and when he said his name, there was a silence on the other end that lasted long enough to tell him she was deciding whether to hang up. "Mrs. Kang," he said. "How is she?" Another pause. Then Seo-yeon said carefully, "She was always kind, sir." "I know she was." He kept his voice even. "I want to know what you saw. I want you to tell me everything, and I want you to understand that nothing you say will cause any consequences for you. That's not what this call is." A very long silence. Then she talked. She talked for 38 minutes. Min-jae listened without interrupting, taking notes on a legal pad in the shorthand he'd developed over years of meetings where recording devices were inadvisable. Seo-yeon told him about the evenings she'd brought food to Nia's room on nights when Nia had been visibly left out of dinner. She told him about the afternoon she'd overheard Jisoo tell a visiting family friend that Min-jae's wife was a phase he hadn't grown out of yet. She told him about the time she'd found Nia sitting on the floor of the second-floor sitting room in the dark, not crying, just sitting. And Nia had looked up at her and said, "Please don't tell him, just sit with me for a minute." "She made me promise," Seo-yeon said. "Mrs. Kang, she made me promise not to tell you. She said she didn't want you to have to choose." "Why were you dismissed?" Min-jae said. A pause. "Madam Kang said I was becoming too personally involved with the household members, that it was unprofessional." Another pause. "I think it was because Mrs. Kang had started eating dinner with me in the kitchen on the bad nights, and someone told Madam Kang about it." "Someone? I don't know who." Min-jae looked at his notepad. "You'll receive a call from my personal accountant tomorrow morning. Don't be alarmed. You're being compensated for what you were owed." "Sir, I don't—" "You sat with my wife on the floor in the dark," Min-jae said. "That's not nothing." He ended the call. He sat for a while after that without doing anything. The light in the executive suite had shifted from afternoon white to the softer, dimmer gold of early evening. Through the glass wall he could see the corridor, the occasional nurse moving past, the distant exit sign burning red above the stairwell door. He thought about what he was going to do. He had spent 20 years building a reputation around a particular principle, that the consequences of betrayal were total and irreversible, not cruel for its own sake. He had never been that, but absolute. When someone in his world crossed a line, the response was complete, and it was permanent, and everyone in that world understood why. It was the foundation of everything he'd built. Take that away, and the whole architecture collapsed. The people who had done this to Nia were his mother and his sister. He held that fact in his mind and turned it around and looked at all of its sides. He was not going to pretend it wasn't what it was. He was not going to manufacture exceptions because the people involved were family. He had watched men try that. He had watched what it cost them. The only thing worse than having a principle was having it selectively. But he also knew, had known since the hospital corridor before dawn, that Nia would ask him not to destroy them. He had heard her say it herself, "I can't be the reason he loses his family." The tragedy of loving someone that well is that it puts you in the position of having to decide how much their mercy should govern your response to someone else's cruelty. He didn't have that answer yet, but he had the beginning of one. He went to her room at 7 that evening. She was awake, propped against pillows, with a cup of tea cooling on the tray beside her. She looked better, still pale, still thin around the edges, in a way the illness had ground into her, but her eyes were sharper, and the gray-white cast of her skin had softened. She watched him cross the room and sit down. "You have the face," she said. "What face?" "The one where you're being very calm because you've already decided something and you're figuring out how to tell me." He looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them broke it. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer me honestly, not the way you've been answering me for however long this has been going on. Honestly." She was quiet. "How long?" he said. Something moved behind her eyes. She looked down at the cup on the tray. "Min-jae, Nia." She pressed her lips together. "From pretty early," she said. "The first year it was hard. I thought it was just adjustment. New country, new family. I didn't speak Korean well yet. I thought I was misreading things." A pause. "By the second year, I wasn't misreading things anymore." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you love your mother." She said it simply, without accusation, which made it worse. "And because you already carry so much, the business, the things you can't tell me about, all of it. I wasn't going to be one more thing that cost you something. That wasn't your decision to make." "I know," she said quietly. "I know that now. I just She stopped. Her jaw moved. I got used to managing it, and then I got too used to it, and then it had just been going on long enough that there didn't seem to be a right time. She looked at him. I was so tired, Min-jae. Not angry, just tired. He nodded once. He reached out and took her hand. I'm going to fix this, he said. Please, don't. I'm not asking your permission, he said, and then immediately, more gently, I'm telling you so you're not surprised. I'm going to fix it, but I need you to rest, and I need you to get better, and I need you to trust me to handle this the right way. Your version of the right way. My version, he agreed, but different from before. I promise you that. She studied him. She had always been able to read him better than anyone he'd ever sat across from, including men whose entire survival depended on reading people correctly. He held her gaze and let her see whatever she needed to see. Finally, slowly, she nodded. He stayed until she fell asleep. Then he went back to the executive suite and picked up his phone and called a number he had not called in 4 years. His personal legal advisor, a man named Huang, who handled the kind of restructuring that required absolute discretion and worked best when initiated quietly, before anyone knew it was coming. I need to talk to you about the family trust, Min-jae said when Huang answered. Specifically, the asset schedules. And I need it to be tomorrow morning. A pause. Then Huang said carefully, Is this a time-sensitive matter? Everything I do is time-sensitive, Min-jae said. 8 o'clock. My office. He was about to end the call when his phone buzzed with a message from a number he didn't recognize. The message was 6 words long. He read it twice. Then he set the phone down and looked at the wall and understood that whatever controlled response he'd been constructing in his head for the past 18 hours had just become considerably more complicated because the person who had sent this message was not someone he had expected to be involved. And the thing they were telling him changed the shape of everything he thought he had known about why his wife had ended up in this hospital in the first place. The message was from a number registered to a prepaid phone purchased at a convenience store in Mapogu 3 weeks ago. Min-jae knew this because within 4 minutes of reading those 6 words, he had Sung-woo running the number through the trace protocol they used for anonymous communications, a system that cost more per month than most people earned in a year and returned results faster than any law enforcement database he'd ever been compelled to interact with. The 6 words were, she didn't collapse. She was helped. He read them again. The syntax was deliberate. Not she was pushed or someone did this. The careful, specific passivity of she was helped was the language of someone who understood exactly what they were saying and wanted to leave room to walk it back if necessary. Someone who knew enough to be afraid of saying more but couldn't live with saying nothing. He put the phone face down on the desk. He picked it up again. He set it down. Sung-woo came back into the room at 9:14 p.m. with a single printed sheet and placed it on the desk without speaking. Min-jae looked at it. The number traced to a burner. The burner had been activated once, used to send this message, and gone dark immediately after. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing well enough to do it once and stop. Can we get anything else off it? Min-jae said. The activation location, Sung-woo said. Convenience store in Mapo. Camera footage would require a formal request. We don't make formal requests. No, Sung-woo agreed. I have someone going to the store now. Min-jae looked at the sheet again. She was helped. He thought about Nia collapsing in the main foyer near the staircase. He thought about the timeline the hospital had given him. Weeks of underlying illness, they'd said. A condition that had been progressing without treatment. He thought about the word the doctor had used, the one that had rewired his brain on the helicopter to Hanada. Then he thought about the fact that the only person who had known the full scope of Nia's illness before that collapse, the only person in that household who would have had both the access and the motive to accelerate something that was already happening, was someone with a key to every room and authority over every person on the staff. He picked up his phone and called the one man he trusted with this category of problem. Not Sung-woo. Sung-woo was security, operations, the architecture of physical safety. This was different. This required a man named Baek Ji-hoon, who had worked in the organization's intelligence function for 14 years and who Min-jae had once watched sit in a room with a suspected informant for 6 hours, asking the same 3 questions in slightly different configurations until the man simply ran out of ways to lie. Baek picked up on the second ring. I need a medical review, Min-jae said. Everything related to my wife's condition. What she had, when it could have started, what would have accelerated it, and what someone with household access would have needed to know or do to make it worse. A pause. I need it by 6 in the morning. Silence on the other end. Not hesitation. Beck didn't hesitate. It was the silence of a man filing information into the correct category. Understood, Beck said. Anything else? Not yet, Min-jae said, but keep your phone on. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in the executive suite until past midnight, then walked the hospital corridor for 20 minutes, the way he walked when his mind was moving faster than his body knew what to do with. A habit from his early years in the organization, when the work required staying awake in places where sleeping could be fatal and movement was the only thing that kept the mind from consuming itself. At 1 a.m., he went and sat outside Nia's room. Not inside. He didn't want to wake her. He sat in the corridor chair, the one left there for family members keeping vigil, and leaned his head back against the wall and looked at the ceiling and thought about the architecture of what had been done. Because if the message was true, if someone in that house had actively worsened Nia's condition rather than simply neglecting her, then what he'd spent the previous 18 hours cataloging was not the full picture. The footage, the dismissals, the erased photographs, those were cruelty, deliberate, sustained, cowardly cruelty. But they were comprehensible. He had a category for them. This was something else. At 2:30 a.m., his phone buzzed. Sung-woo had reached the convenience store owner. The store's interior camera had a 14-day loop. The purchase of the prepaid phone was 19 days ago. Gone. But the owner remembered the customer. He remembered because the customer had paid in cash and asked which phone had the longest battery life, and then stood at the counter for almost 2 minutes without moving, looking at the phone in their hand like they were deciding something. The owner described a woman. Young. Well-dressed for a convenience store at that hour. Short hair, a small scar near her left eyebrow. Min-jae read Sung-woo's text summary of this and felt the specific cold clarity of recognizing someone from a description. Short hair. Scar near the left eyebrow. Young, well-dressed. The name arrived in his mind before he finished the sentence. Han Chae-rin, 24 years old. Junior household coordinator, hired 11 months ago through a staffing agency his sister Jisoo had used for years. Responsible for scheduling, household logistics, staff coordination. She had access to the household calendar, the staff rosters, the medical supply closet, the kitchen, and, because of a security permissions overlap that had never been corrected, the private residence floors. She had also, Min-jae now recalled, been visibly uncomfortable at the hospital on the morning of Nia's admission. He had attributed it to the general tension of the situation. He had not looked at it twice. He called Sung-woo. Han Chae-rin, he said. Where is she now? Household staff are at the mansion. She'd be there. I want her in a room by 7 a.m., not a police room, my room. A pause. And Sung-woo, quietly. I don't want her to know it's coming until she's already there. The morning arrived the way winter mornings in Seoul arrive. Gray first, then a thin pale light that doesn't commit to warmth, the kind of light that makes everything look like evidence. Min-jae was showered and in a fresh suit by 5:30. Baek Ji-hoon delivered his medical analysis by 6, as requested, in the form of a 12-page document that Min-jae read twice at the desk, with a cup of coffee going cold beside him. The document was thorough. Baek had pulled Nia's hospital intake records, cross-referenced them with the timeline of her symptoms as reported by the attending physician, and consulted some anonymously through a third party with a specialist in the relevant field. The conclusion was careful but unambiguous in its implication. The progression of Nia's condition in the final 6 weeks before her collapse had been significantly faster than the underlying illness alone would typically produce. The attending physician had noted this anomaly in his intake assessment and flagged it for follow-up. The follow-up was still pending. Beck had also included on the final page a list of 3 substances, common, available, not controlled, that when administered in small repeated doses over several weeks could produce the accelerated symptom progression described. Substances that would not be flagged in a standard tox screen. Substances that could be introduced through food or drink without detection. Min-jae read the list. He set the document down. He sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked to the room where Sung-woo had placed Han Chae-rin. She was sitting at a small table in one of the hospital's administrative conference rooms on the ground floor, a room Sung-woo had arranged through the hospital administrator, who had a long relationship with the Kang family's philanthropic foundation and understood that certain requests did not require explanation. Chae-rin was dressed as if for a normal workday, which meant either she was very good at controlling her exterior or she genuinely didn't know why she'd been asked to come. Her hands were folded on the table. Her eyes went to Min-jae when he walked in, and something in them shifted. A micro-movement, barely there, gone in under a second. But Min-jae had spent 20 years reading micro-movements. He sat down across from her. He did not bring anyone else into the room. He set his phone on the table between them, face up, so she could see that it was recording. "You sent me a message last night," he said. She said nothing. Her breathing was controlled but slightly shallow. "I know it was you," he said. "I'm not asking you to confirm it. I'm telling you so we can skip the part where you decide whether to deny it." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on the table. "I want you to tell me what you know, all of it, from the beginning. And I want you to understand that right now, in this room, telling me the truth is the only version of this conversation that ends in a way that's good for you." Her jaw moved. "I didn't—" She stopped, started again. "I didn't know what it was going to become. I want you to know that. Tell me what it started as." She looked at the phone on the table. Then she looked at him. "Ms. Jisoo asked me," she said, 8 months ago. She said Mrs. Kang had anxiety and difficulty sleeping, and there was a supplement, she called it a supplement, that the family sometimes used, a calming formula. She said Mrs. Kang had refused to take it herself, but that it was harmless, and it would help her and it would make the household run more smoothly. She asked me to add a small amount to Mrs. Kang's evening tea. Min-jae kept his face completely still. She said it was the same thing they gave elderly family members. Charon continued. Her voice was starting to lose its structure. She said it was nothing. She showed me a bottle. It looked like something you could buy anywhere. I added it to the tea 3 times a week the way she said, and I didn't think— "How long?" Min-jae said. 6 months. The room was very quiet. 6 months ago, Min-jae said carefully, is when my wife's condition began deteriorating at an accelerated rate. Karen's eyes were wet. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I didn't know what was in it. Not at first, and then about 2 months ago, I started to notice she was getting worse, and I asked Ms. Jisoo if we should stop, and she said Mrs. Kang's health had nothing to do with the supplement and that I should keep to my responsibilities." Her voice cracked on the last word. "But I looked it up after the collapse. I looked up the bottle she'd given me, and what was written on it wasn't what was inside it. I had it tested at a lab in Sinchon. It took 3 weeks to get the results back, and by then Mrs. Kang was already in hospital." "You tested it," Min-jae said. "You have the results." "On my phone," she said, "in an email from the lab." "Show me." She unlocked her phone with hands that were not quite steady and found the email and turned the screen toward him. He looked at it. The lab name, the date, the chemical analysis. 3 of the items in the compound matched 2 of the 3 substances on Baek's list. Min-jae sat back in the chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. Just 1 moment, then he looked back at Charon. "You're going to send that email to this address," he said, writing a number on a card and sliding it across the table. "Then you're going to write down everything you just told me in a signed statement. Sungwoo will bring you paper." "What happens to me?" she said. "You're not my problem right now," he said, and stood up. He walked out of the conference room and down the corridor toward the elevator, and he moved at the normal pace he always moved at, which was deliberate and even and gave nothing away to anyone watching. And he pressed the elevator button and waited and stepped inside. And when the doors closed, he put his back against the wall of the elevator car and pressed his hand over his mouth and stood there while the numbers changed. Jisoo, not his mother. His mother's cruelty had been cold and social, and the cruelty of a woman who had decided Nia didn't belong and had enforced that decision through silence and exclusion and the quiet manipulation of household hierarchies. That was devastating. That was something he was already prepared to respond to with everything he had. But Jisoo, his sister, who had sat across from him at tables for 40 years, who had called him when her son was sick, and when her marriage had gone through its difficult year, and when she'd needed someone to tell her that things were going to be fine. Who had put something into his wife's tea for 6 months? He had not been prepared for this. He had thought he was prepared. He had spent the night constructing a full architecture of response. The legal restructuring, the asset transfers, the conversation he would have with his mother, the deliberate and measured consequences he would apply with the precision he applied to everything. He had built the whole thing in his head over the course of a sleepless night, and it had felt sufficient. It was not sufficient. The elevator opened. He walked to the executive suite. He closed the door. He sat at the desk and called Huang. his legal advisor. "The meeting this morning," he said. "We're expanding scope." "How broadly?" Huang said. "Broadly enough that you're going to want your partner there too." A pause. "Minjai, how serious is this?" "My sister poisoned my wife," he said. The word poisoned sat in the air of that office like something physical, like something that had been in the room the whole time and had just been named. "I need everything we can move, moved. I need it airtight, and I need it done before she understands what's coming." Silence from Huang. 8 o'clock, Huang said finally. "I'll have everything we need." Minjai ended the call. He sat. Outside the window, Seoul was fully awake now, the gray morning having conceded to a cold winter brightness that lit nothing warmly. Traffic sounds rose from 12 floors below. Somewhere in this building, his wife was waking up. Somewhere in his mansion across the city, his sister was beginning what she believed to be a normal day. He thought about what normal felt like. He couldn't locate it. He understood that it was gone, that the version of his life that had existed 48 hours ago, even the broken version, even the version built on a foundation of his wife's silent suffering, was no longer available to return to. The message had ended that. The lab report had ended it further. The particular expression on Charon's face when she said 6 months had driven a nail through whatever remained. He was going to walk into a room with his sister and he was going to look at her face, and he was going to know that while he was in Tokyo arguing about port access, she had been putting something into the evening tea of the woman who had never done a single thing to harm her except exist in a space Jisoo had decided she wasn't entitled to. He was going to have to look at her without letting what he felt become what he did. Because if he let it become what he did, if he walked into that room as the version of himself he'd been at 22 or 27 or even 35, there would be consequences that could not be restructured or legally managed or explained away. And Nia would wake up and ask him what happened, and he would have to tell her that he had become, once again, exactly the monster she had spent years protecting him from becoming. She had endured 6 months of a slow poisoning rather than risk watching him become that. He owed her something better than giving her the things she'd sacrificed herself to prevent. He pressed both hands flat on the desk. He looked at them. The knuckles. The old scar across his right hand from a night in Busan 17 years ago. The hands of a man who had made choices that could not be unmade. He breathed in, he breathed out. And then his phone rang. Not Sung-woo, not Baek, not Huang, but the hospital's main floor line, the number they used for urgent patient communications. And when he answered, the nurse's voice on the other end was professionally calm. In the way that means the situation is not calm, and she told him that Mrs. Kang had asked to see him immediately, that she was distressed, that she had seen something on a phone that had been left in her room, and could he come now? He was already moving before she finished the sentence, because he understood immediately, with the precision of a man who had spent a lifetime anticipating how things could go wrong at the worst possible moment, exactly what Nia had seen, and who had made sure she would see it. He covered the distance from the executive suite to Nia's floor in under 3 minutes. Not running. Minjae did not run in corridors. Running was for men who had lost control of the situation, and even now, even with his chest doing something that had nothing to do with the exertion of walking fast, he maintained the deliberate, measured pace that 20 years had made instinct. But his jaw was tight, and his hands were loose at his sides in the specific way they got loose when the rest of him was anything but. And the 2 men who fell into step behind him when he hit the corridor knew from the angle of his shoulders alone that the temperature of the next several minutes was going to require their full attention. The nurse outside Nia's room was young, maybe 26, and she had the expression of someone who had delivered news that landed worse than expected and was still processing the aftermath. She started to speak when she saw him. He held up one hand, not unkindly, and pushed the door open himself. Nia was sitting upright in the bed, not reclining, sitting fully upright, both hands in her lap, her back not touching the pillow behind her. The hospital bracelet caught the morning light. Her face was the kind of still that isn't calm, the kind of still that is what's left after something moves through a person and takes everything that was loose with it. There was a phone on the tray table. Not hers. A cheap handset, older model, the kind bought for a single purpose. The screen was dark, but not locked. Minjae looked at the phone, then at her. "Close the door," she said. He stepped inside and closed it behind him. He didn't sit. He stood at the foot of the bed and looked at her and waited. "Someone left that," she said. Her voice was level in a way that cost her something. He could hear the cost of it. "On the chair." While I was sleeping, I woke up and it was there. There was a message already open on the screen. He didn't ask what the message said, he already knew. Whoever had left it had known he would be downstairs, had known his movement through the building, had timed it precisely. "Tell me," he said. Her eyes came up to his. "It said your sister has been poisoning me." The word landed in the room the same way it had landed in the executive suite, like something physical, like something that displaced air. But this time it was Nia saying it, in a hospital bed where she had been sent by surgery, in a voice that was holding itself together through sheer force of something he didn't have a name for. "Min Jae," her voice fractured slightly on the second syllable and then hardened again. "Tell me that's not true." He looked at her face. He had promised her honesty. He had sat in this room 11 hours ago and told her he wasn't going to be the person she had to protect anymore. "I can't tell you that," he said. The sound she made was not a cry. It was smaller than that and more devastating. A single sharp exhale, like something being cut through cleanly. She pressed one hand over her mouth for 3 seconds. Then she lowered it. "How long have you known?" she said. "Since last night. I was going to tell you this morning." "Were you?" "Yes." "Or were you going to handle it first and tell me after?" she said. And there was no accusation in it, only the exhausted accuracy of a woman who knew him completely. He didn't answer, because the honest answer was that he hadn't decided yet, and they both knew what that meant. She looked at the window. The winter light came through it flat and cold and lit nothing in her face gently. 6 months, she said. It wasn't a question. She'd read the message. "I've been sick for 8 months. I thought it was stress. I thought it was the winter or the altitude change when we traveled or something I ate." A pause. "It was her." "Yes." "She sat across from me at dinner," Nia said. Her voice had taken on a quality he'd never heard in it before. Not anger, not grief, something that came before both of those, something more fundamental. "She sat across from me and asked how I was feeling, and I told her I was tired, and she said I should drink more tea." He said nothing. "She said I should drink more tea," Nia repeated, and this time there was something in it that broke the surface. Min Jae crossed the room in 4 steps and sat on the edge of the bed and put his arms around her, and she didn't resist it, but she didn't collapse into it either. She stayed upright against him, rigid with the effort of containing something too large for the space they were in, and her breathing was shallow and fast against his shoulder, and he held her and said nothing because there was nothing adequate to say. After a while, her breathing slowed. She pulled back. She looked at his face. Her eyes were dry. He didn't know how. "Where is she?" Nia said. "At the mansion. She doesn't know I know yet." "When were you going to—" "Today," he said. "This morning." She looked at him for a long moment. "What are you going to do to her?" He held her gaze. "What needs to be done?" "Min Jae," her voice dropped. "I need you to hear me right now. Not the version of you that handles things. You, the man I married." She waited until she was sure he was listening with all of it. Not the part that was already 3 steps ahead planning the response. Not the part that was managing the situation, but the actual unguarded center of him. "Whatever you do to her, whatever you decide she deserves, I need you to do it in a way that you can still be the person you are right now when it's over. Because the person you are right now is the one I chose, not the other one." He held her gaze. "I hear you," he said. "Do you?" "Yes," he said. "I hear you." She searched his face for another moment. Then she nodded once and looked away, and he understood that the conversation was over and the next thing was his to carry. He stood up. He bent and pressed his mouth to her forehead and held it there for 3 seconds. Then he straightened and picked up the phone from the tray table, the cheap handset with the open message, and put it in his jacket pocket and walked to the door. "Min Jae," he stopped. "Come back," she said. Not a plea, an instruction. "When it's done, come back." "I will," he said. He walked out. In the corridor, he stopped and looked at the handset. The message was from the same untraceable number as the previous night, but this one was longer and included a photograph. He looked at the photograph for the first time now, because in the room with Nia, he hadn't let himself. It showed Jisoo in the mansion kitchen, taken from an angle consistent with the security camera above the refrigerator unit at a timestamp from 6 weeks ago. She was standing at the counter with her back partially turned, and in her hands was a small dark bottle. The same bottle Cherin had described. Someone inside that house had been documenting this, had been collecting it for weeks or months, had waited until Nia was in the hospital and Min Jae was on Korean soil before releasing it, first to him, with the six-word message that gave him the direction, and then to Nia directly, which forced his hand on the timeline. He thought about who had that kind of patience and that kind of access, and that particular willingness to burn everything down at a specific moment. Then he thought about his mother. Yeon-hee had lived in that house for decades. She had run it with the absolute authority of a woman who had decided long ago that the household was her domain in the same way the criminal network was Min Jae's. She had access to every camera, every schedule, every staff member's routine. She had, by Min Jae's own accounting, orchestrated the exclusion of Nia from the family in ways that were deliberate and sustained. But there was a line, even for Yeon-hee. He had constructed in the small hours of the night an architecture of belief, that his mother was capable of cruelty through omission, through social engineering, through the accumulated weight of 1,000 small humiliations. He had not believed she was capable of crossing the line that Jisoo had crossed. And if she had discovered that Jisoo had crossed it, he called Sung-woo. "Get my mother to the mansion's main hall," he said. "Not her rooms. The hall. And do it now before you bring Jisoo down." "Your mother as well," Sung-woo said carefully. "Yes." A pause. "And the rest of the family. All of them," Min Jae said. "Everyone who lives under that roof, and everyone who has a seat at that table. I want them all there when I arrive." He looked at the window at the end of the corridor, the flat winter light beyond it. "Call Hwang. Tell him to come to the mansion instead of my office, and tell him to bring everything we prepared." "Understood," Sung-woo said. "What about the screens?" The mansion's grand hall had been designed with a recessed ceiling system, something Min Jae had installed 3 years ago for a presentation to a consortium of business partners, 8 large screens that dropped from housing units in the crown molding on a motor system. He had used them twice for business. He had never used them for anything else. "Set them up," he said. "Load every file from the archive drives, everything we pulled last night, and the lab report, and the photograph." A silence. Then, "Yes, sir." Min Jae ended the call and walked to the elevator. The drive from the hospital to the mansion took 22 minutes in morning traffic. Min Jae sat in the back of the car and did not look at his phone and did not speak. The city moved past the window. A dry cleaner's rolling up its gate, a schoolchild in a red coat waiting at a crosswalk, an old man walking a small dog past a construction fence covered in green mesh. All of it ordinary. All of it belonging to a world that did not know that in 22 minutes, a family was going to be taken apart and reassembled into something different or not reassembled at all. The mansion sat behind its walls in the cold morning air. The gate opened as the car approached. Min Jae got out before the car fully stopped and walked up the stone steps and through the front door without pausing. The grand hall was a long, high-ceilinged room with dark wood paneling and the kind of furniture that communicated old money in the particular Korean register. Formal, imposing, arranged to make the person sitting in it feel the weight of the lineage they were representing. 8 people were already seated when he walked in. Cousins. His sister's husband, Taewon, who had the look of a man who had dressed quickly. An uncle who was in his 70s and had the particular stillness of someone who had seen enough of this family's history to know when to make himself small. Jisoo, in a charcoal blazer, seated to the left of the central table, her hands folded with a care that telegraphed how hard she was working to look untroubled. His mother was at the far end, standing rather than seated, which meant she'd been told enough to understand this was not a routine gathering. Her face was composed in its usual architecture, but her hands, Min Jae noticed, were folded in front of her rather than at her sides. Yeon-hee only folded her hands when she was bracing. Hwang was near the wall to the right, with his associate and 2 bags of documents. Sung-woo stood at the door to the hall. 2 other men were at the side exits. Nobody spoke when Min Jae entered. The room had the quality of a held breath. 8 people collectively waiting for the shape of the next thing. Min Jae stood in the center of the room. He looked at Jisoo first. She met his gaze. Her chin lifted approximately 2 millimeters, a reflex, a defense, a thing she'd been doing since childhood when she felt cornered. He had seen it 1,000 times. He had always, before today, understood it as the gesture of a sister who was proud and difficult, and sometimes unkind. He now understood it as the gesture of a woman who had looked at his wife's declining health and continued anyway. He looked away from her. He looked at his mother. Yeon-hee looked back at him with an expression that was harder to read than Jisoo's because Yeon-hee had had more decades to build the architecture of her composure. But something in her eyes, some quality of watchfulness that was different from her usual surveillance of a room, told him that his mother was not entirely surprised to be here. He let the silence run for 10 seconds. In his experience, 10 seconds of silence in a room of people who don't know what's coming produces more honesty than most forms of pressure. Then he nodded once toward the ceiling, and Sungwoo hit the control panel by the door. 8 screens descended from the ceiling housing units on their quiet motor systems. The room's ambient light dimmed automatically as they powered up. The first image on every screen was the timestamp, 14 months ago, a Tuesday evening. The grand dining room shot from the upper corner. Nia, standing when his mother entered, saying good evening to a woman who walked past her like furniture. Nobody in the room moved. The footage played. Min-jae watched his family watch themselves. He watched his uncle's face move through something and settle into stillness. He watched 2 cousins exchange a glance and then look away from each other. He watched Taewon, his sister's husband, develop a particular tension around the jaw that suggested he was doing the math on his position in the import business and not liking what he was arriving at. He watched Jisoo watch the screen with an expression of complete control that was, in its totality, the most incriminating thing in the room. He watched his mother. Yeon-hee watched the footage of herself walking past Nia without acknowledging her, and something crossed her face. Not guilt, he didn't think, or not only guilt, something more complicated. A recognition, perhaps. The look of a woman seeing something she had done reflected back at her in a frame that removed all of the context she had used to justify it to herself. The footage ran for 8 minutes. Then it cut to the Lunar New Year footage. Then to Jisoo's phone call in the kitchen. Then to Nia standing in the foyer, dressed and waiting, while his mother walked past her. Then the lab report filled the screens. Then the photograph from 6 weeks ago, Jisoo at the kitchen counter, the bottle in her hands, the timestamp clear and unambiguous. Min-jae watched his sister see the photograph. Her composure lasted 4 more seconds. Then she stood up from her chair and said, "That is not what it looks like." "Sit down," Min-jae said. "Min-jae, I need you to let me explain." "Sit down, Jisoo." Not a shout. Something worse than a shout. A voice from which every normal register of human warmth had been removed, like a room stripped of furniture, like a face with nothing left to read. She sat. He walked to the center of the room. He stood where everyone could see him, and he looked at his sister and he said, "The lab confirmed the compound. I have a signed statement from the staff member who administered it. I have the photograph. And I have the medical analysis showing that my wife's condition accelerated in direct correlation with the 6 months the compound was introduced into her diet." He paused. "Is there any part of that you want to tell me is wrong?" The room was absolutely silent. Jisoo's hands were no longer folded. They were flat on the surface of the table, and he could see from where he stood that they were not entirely steady. "I never meant for her to—" She stopped, started again. "I thought it would make her want to leave. I thought if she felt unwell long enough she would go home. I never wanted her to—" "You never wanted her to end up in surgery," Min-jae said. "No." "But you continued for 6 months." "I thought—" "You continued," he said, "for 6 months. While she believed she was developing an illness. While she was calling me from video calls telling me she was fine because she didn't want me to worry." He stopped. He breathed. "While she was drinking her tea." Jisoo's chin was trembling now. It was the first time he had seen his sister's chin tremble since she was a teenager. "I'm sorry," she said. "Min-jae, I am so—" "Don't," he said. "Don't do that in this room." She stopped. He turned to the rest of the family. He looked at his mother last. Yeon-hee was still standing at the far end of the room. Her hands were still folded, but she was looking at him differently now, not with the surveillance of a matriarch, but with something else, something that might, in another context, have looked like grief. "You knew," he said to her. A silence. "Not the compound," Yeon-hee said. Her voice was the steadiest thing in the room. "I didn't know about the compound until 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. I found the bottle. I confronted Jisoo." Her jaw moved. "She told me what she had done. I told her to stop. I told her to dispose of it and say nothing and pray that your wife recovered without—" "You told her to say nothing," Min-jae said. "I was trying to protect the family. You were protecting the person who poisoned my wife," he said. "Which means you made a choice. Which means you are not separate from it." Yeon-hee looked at him. For the first time in his memory, his mother looked at him without the advantage of her composure. Her eyes were bright with something she was not going to allow to fall in this room, in front of this many people, and he understood that about her even now. She was not going to cry. She was going to stand there and hold it in a steel grip, and that was who she was, and it was not going to change today. But she looked at him without her armor, and what was underneath it was not the face of a woman without regret. He looked away from her. He looked at Huang. "The documents," he said. Huang opened the first bag. The next 40 minutes were the most efficient dismantling of a family's power structure that anyone in that room would ever witness. Min-jae stood in the center of the grand hall and did not sit down and did not raise his voice above its current register, that flat, drained, absolute tone, while Huang placed documents in front of people who signed them because the alternative had been made clear without ever being stated explicitly. Taewon was removed from the import operation effective immediately. The contract termination had been prepared the previous evening. His signature was required in one place. He signed. Jisu's access to the family trust was suspended pending a formal review that Huang would manage. Every financial instrument in her name that drew from the Kang estate was frozen. She would retain her personal accounts and her home. Everything connected to the family was gone. His mother's position as chair of the foundation board was dissolved. Her household authority, the power she had exercised over staff, over schedules, over the invisible architecture of daily life in the mansion, was transferred on paper to a household manager who reported directly to Min-jae and to no one else. And then Huang produced the final set of documents. Min-jae had dictated these to Huang at 6 in the morning in the hospital executive suite, and Huang had spent 2 hours with his associate ensuring they were legally unassailable. They transferred, in Nia Brooks Kang's name, a list of assets that made Taiwan visibly pale and made his uncle look at the ceiling. The sole residence she had always lived in as a guest in someone else's house. 2 properties in other cities. Controlling shares in 3 legitimate companies that generated enough income to make a person independent of anyone or anything for the rest of their life. It was not about the money. Min-jae had understood this even as he dictated it. It was about the declaration that the money made, the public, documented, legally irreversible statement of where his wife stood in relation to everything he had built and what it would mean to anyone in his world, going forward, to direct cruelty at her. He looked at the room when the last document was signed. 8 people looking back at him. Some with shock. Some with the careful blankness of people calculating their new position. His uncle with something in his eyes that, in another man, Min-jae would have called respect. Jisu was looking at her hands. His mother was looking at him. "Is there anything," Min-jae said to the room, "that anyone wants to say?" Silence. "Then we're finished," he said. "Sungwoo will coordinate the administrative transfers. Anyone with questions about the specifics can direct them to Huang." He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd placed it. "One more thing." He looked directly at his sister. "The compound," he said. "The lab report, the statement from the staff member, the photograph." He held her gaze. "I have decided for now not to involve anyone outside this family. That decision is contingent on your full cooperation with everything Huang requires, your complete absence from this household going forward, and your understanding that this is not forgiveness." He let that land. "This is a choice I'm making for my wife, not for you." Jisu's throat moved. She nodded. He walked toward the door. He was 3 steps from it when his mother's voice came from behind him. Not loud, not commanding, stripped of every register of authority she usually deployed, just her voice, underneath all of it. The voice of a woman who was 63 years old and had just watched her family restructured around a truth she had chosen too late to face. "Min-jae." He stopped. He didn't turn. "I'm sorry," she said. The room held its breath. He stood with his back to her and his hand not quite on the door, and in the silence of the grand hall of the house where he had grown up, he heard something in his mother's voice that he had not heard since he was a child, something underneath the architecture, something she had spent decades building over. And he understood, with the particular clarity of a man who had just spent 40 minutes being as cold as he was capable of being, that the hardest thing he was going to do today was not what he had just done. It was what he did next. He stood with his back to his mother for a long time, not because he didn't hear her, he heard her. The word had moved through the room and landed against him with the particular weight that words carry when they arrive too late, and the person saying them knows it and says them anyway, not because they expect the word to fix anything, but because not saying it anymore had become unbearable. The grand hall was completely silent, 8 people not breathing at full capacity. Huang with his documents half-packed, frozen mid-motion. Sungwoo at the door with his hands at his sides. Jisu looking at the table. Taewon looking at nothing. Min-jae turned around. He looked at his mother across the length of that room, across the dark wood floor and the cold morning light coming through the tall windows, and the space that had, in the last 40 minutes, been reorganized from the inside out. Yeon-hee stood at the far end exactly where she had stood throughout. Her hands were no longer folded. They were at her sides, and they were not quite still, and that small, involuntary motion in the fingers of her right hand was the most honest thing Min-jae had seen from her in longer than he could calculate. She was 63 years old. She had built her position in this family from a starting point that Min-jae, in his adult years, had come to understand was harder than she had ever described to him. She had survived a marriage to a man who was, by most measures, a difficult and occasionally brutal person. She had raised her children inside a world that did not reward softness and had made the decision, perhaps so early it no longer felt like a decision, to perform hardness so completely that it became indistinguishable from character. He knew all of this. He had always known all of this. It had never, until this moment, been required to coexist in his mind with the footage from the dining room and the lab report and the 6 months of evening tea. He walked back towards her. He stopped when he was close enough that this was a conversation and not a declaration. He looked at her face. She looked at his. Up close, the bright quality in her eyes was more visible and more controlled and more costly than it had been from across the room. 3 weeks ago, he said quietly now, when you found out what Jisoo had done, if Nia hadn't collapsed, if this hadn't ended the way it ended, would you have told me? His mother held his gaze. She was not a woman who looked away when the answer was difficult. That much had always been true. I don't know, she said. It was the most honest thing she had said to him in years. He recognized it immediately, and it hit him somewhere unguarded. I told myself I would find a way to manage it, she continued. Her voice was quiet and even, and underneath the evenness was something fraying at its edges. I told myself I would make Jisoo fix it, that your wife would recover, and that I would find a way to... She stopped. I told myself a great many things that I now understand were the lies of a woman who did not want to look at what her family had become. What it had become, Min-jae said, or what she had made it. A pause. Both, she said. Both are true. He looked at her for another moment. The portraits, he said. Editing Nia out of the photographs, dismissing the staff who treated her with basic decency. The dinners. He kept his voice below anything the rest of the room could clearly hear. That was you, not Jisoo. That was you. Yes. Why? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then, because I was afraid of her. He hadn't expected that word. Afraid. She looked at you, his mother said, and something shifted in her face, something beneath the architecture that she had spent a lifetime constructing. The way I looked at your father before I understood what I was looking at, and I watched what that kind of love costs a woman in this family. I watched what it costs, and I thought... She stopped again. I thought if I made her uncomfortable enough, she would leave before it cost her too much, before you became too much. Her jaw moved. I understand now that that reasoning was... I understand what it was. Min-jae looked at his mother's face. He had not expected this particular thing. He had expected denial, or the assertion of tradition, or the posture of a woman who believed she had been operating in the family's best interest. He had not expected this. The buried arithmetic of a woman who had watched her own marriage and drawn the wrong conclusion, and then spent 6 years trying to protect a woman she had decided to resent by driving her away from the only protection available to her. She didn't need protecting from me, Min-jae said. I know that now. You could have known it then. Yes, she said. I could have. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he said, I'm not ready to forgive you. I need you to know that. Not today. I know, but I'm not done with you either. He held her gaze. You're going to call Nia. Not today. She needs time, and so do you. But you're going to call her, and you are not going to do it with an explanation or a defense. You're going to do it the only way it means anything. He paused. Do you understand what I'm telling you? His mother looked at him. Her chin was steady. Her eyes were not. Yes, she said. I understand. He nodded once. Then he turned and walked out of the grand hall and through the front door of the mansion and down the stone steps into the cold winter air, and he stood on the drive for a moment with his face turned up toward a sky that was pale and thin and completely cloudless, and he breathed. The city made its sounds around the walls. A car somewhere. A bird. The distant mechanical exhale of something building or dismantling itself 3 streets over. He got back in the car and told the driver to take him to the hospital. Nia was not in her room when he arrived. For one disorienting second, standing in the doorway of the empty bed, the pulled-back covers and the absent IV stand, he felt something lurch in his chest that was pure animal panic, the kind that doesn't wait for rational processing, that goes straight from the eyes to the adrenal system without passing through thought. Then a nurse appeared at his elbow and told him Mrs. Kang had asked to be moved to the rooftop garden for some air. The attending physician had approved it. She was up there with a blanket and a wheelchair and one of the floor nurses. He took the stairs rather than the elevator. The rooftop garden was a small space, enclosed on 3 sides by glass panels, open to the sky, with raised planters that in summer presumably held something green, but in winter held only dark soil and a few dormant stalks. There were 2 benches and a paved path between them. Nia was in the wheelchair near the far glass panel, turned toward the view of the city, the blanket over her lap, her hands visible on the armrests. The floor nurse saw him coming and made herself scarce in the way good nurses make themselves scarce, present but invisible, just inside the door behind him. Min-jae walked to where Nia was and sat down on the bench beside the wheelchair, so they were level with each other, both of them looking out at Seoul spread below in the winter morning, the apartment blocks and the office towers, and the river visible as a distant gray-silver line between bridges. She didn't look at him immediately. She was looking at the city with the expression of a person who has been sitting with something large and is still in the process of deciding what to do with it. "Is it done?" she said. "Yes." A pause. "Tell me." He told her. All of it. The footage screening. The documents. What had happened to Jisu's trust access, and Taewon's position, and his mother's authority. He told her about the asset transfers, what was now in her name, what it meant, what he had intended it to mean. He told her about his conversation with his mother at the end. He told her what his mother had said about being afraid. He told her all of it, without editing or softening, because he had promised her honesty, and this was what honesty looked like when the situation was this size. She listened without interrupting. Her hands stayed on the armrests. Her face moved through things he watched carefully and didn't try to interpret for her. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "She was afraid of me," Nia said finally. "That's what she said. Because of the way I looked at you." "Yes." Nia absorbed this. She looked at the city. "That might be the saddest thing I've ever heard," she said. "And I've had a rough week." He looked at her. Something in him, some cramped and overloaded mechanism that had been running at full capacity for 48 hours, released approximately 1 degree. "The assets," Nia said. "The properties, the shares. Yours, legally complete, Huang filed this morning." Min-jae. She turned her head and looked at him directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "I don't want things. I've never wanted things. You know that." "I know," he said. "It's not about the things." "Then what's it about?" "It's about the fact that from this day forward, every person in my world knows what it costs to treat you as anything less than what you are." He held her gaze. "The assets are a language. They're the language my world speaks. I used it to say something that needed to be said in terms no one can misread." She looked at him for a long time. The winter light was doing something to her face that was not unkind, catching the angles of it, the tiredness, the history of the last several months visible in the way a person's face holds the weight of what their body has been through. She looked like someone who had survived something, which she had. "You cried," she said, "in the hallway, outside my room, before you came in." He had not told her that. He looked at her. "The nurse mentioned it," Nia said. "Not gossiping. She said the man outside Mrs. Kang's room had been there for a while and looked like he was having a hard night." A pause. "She said she'd brought him a cup of tea and he'd forgotten it was in his hand." He said nothing. "I've been with you for 6 years," Nia said. "I have never seen you forget something was in your hand." He looked at the city. "I failed you," he said. It came out without construction, without the careful management he'd been applying to language for 2 days. Just the words. In the register they belonged in. "I built the architecture of a life, and I called it protection, and I was across the Pacific negotiating port rights while you were eating dinner alone, while people in my house were dismissing the one staff member who was kind to you, while my sister was—" He stopped. I looked at luxury and called it safety. I looked at my absence and called it sacrifice. And you were... He couldn't finish it. Nia reached out and put her hand over his. Hey, she said. He looked at her. I let it happen too, she said. I'm not giving you all of it. I made choices. I decided not to tell you. I decided it was easier to manage it alone than to watch you carry it. She squeezed his hand. We both got it wrong. In different ways. But we both did. What I got wrong could have killed you. What I got wrong almost let it, she said. That's not nothing either. They sat with that for a moment. The mutual, uncomfortable weight of two people who loved each other well enough to look at what they'd each contributed to a disaster without flinching and without distributing it all in one direction. I'm not leaving, Nia said. I want you to know that. I know the last few days have been... I know it's a lot, and I know maybe you thought that finding out everything might make me want to. She shook her head. I'm not leaving. This is my home. You're my home. That's not conditional on things being easy. He turned his hand over beneath hers and held it. I know, he said. I know you're not. But things are going to be different, she said. Not just the documents and the restructuring. You and me, when you travel, you check in, not a video call where I tell you I'm fine and you believe me because it's easier. You ask me the hard questions and I answer them. Yes. And when I tell you something is wrong, even small, even something I think you shouldn't have to deal with, you treat it like it matters. Because it does. Yes, he said, it does. And you come home for dinner, she said. And there was something in her voice that was almost but not quite lighter than the rest of the conversation. Almost. When you can. Not every night. I know what your work is, but when you can. I will, he said. She looked at him for a moment with the particular directness she'd had from the beginning. The woman on the Chicago sidewalk who hadn't looked back, who had told him if you want something, you have to commit, who had married him with her eyes open to the shape of his world and asked only that he not make her regret the distinction between him and his empire. I need you to do something for me, she said. Anything. Go apologize to me, she said. He looked at her. Not here, she said. Not on a rooftop, not in private. She held his gaze. You stood in that grand hall and you restructured everything in front of everyone. You said what needed to be said about what happened to me. But you haven't said it to me. Not directly. Not as a... She searched for the word. Not as the man who was supposed to be paying attention and wasn't, not for that part. He understood. He stood up from the bench. He turned to face her fully, and he lowered himself to one knee on the cold paved surface of the rooftop garden. And he took both of her hands in both of his, and he looked up at her face. The floor nurse behind them was very still. The city continued its sounds below. Traffic, wind against the glass panels, the distant functional noise of soul being soul on a winter morning, indifferent to the specific gravity occurring 12 floors above one of its streets. I'm sorry, he said. Not for what my family did, though I carry that too, but for what I did, for being gone when I should have been present, for measuring what I gave you by its size instead of its quality, for looking at comfort and calling it love, when love would have been asking you the hard questions and staying in the room for the answers. He held her gaze. You spent years protecting me from having to choose between my family and my conscience. You carried something that was mine to carry. And I'm sorry it took this long for me to understand the difference between providing for you and actually seeing you. She was not crying. He had noticed throughout all of this that Nia had not cried. Not in the room when he'd confirmed what had been done to her, not on the rooftop. He understood this now, not as detachment, but as the particular strength of a woman who had learned over years to hold herself upright through things that should have broken her, and had gotten so practiced at it that the habit ran even when the need for it was finally, possibly, over. But her eyes were bright. Get up, she said quietly. Please. He stood. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. He held still under it. Her thumb moved once across his cheekbone. A small gesture, 3 seconds. The kind of thing that means more than the sum of its parts. Okay, she said. Okay. In the weeks that followed, the Kang household reorganized itself around a new center of gravity. It happened slowly. These things don't happen in a single dramatic shift, regardless of how dramatic the event that initiates them. They happen in accumulated small decisions. The morning Min-jae called from Busan to ask not how things were going, but specifically how Nia was sleeping, and then listened to the actual answer. The afternoon, a new household manager started and introduced himself to Nia first, before anyone else. The day Seo-yeon received an employment offer from a Kang-affiliated hospitality company with a salary that would have seemed improbable to the girl who had sat on a floor in the dark and kept a woman company because no one else in the house would. Jisoo did not return to the mansion. She moved through the winter in the house she'd been left with, and the accounts she'd been left with, and the reduced and restructured version of her life, and Min-jae did not contact her. He had meant what he said in the grand hall, that his decision not to go outside the family was for Nia's sake, not for Jisoo's. And he held it. Not because it was comfortable, because the alternative was becoming the version of himself Nia had asked him not to become. And he had looked her in the eye on a rooftop in December and promised her something with his whole body that he intended to keep. The forgiveness, when it eventually came, was not his to give. He understood that too. It was Nia who called Jisoo 4 months later. Min-jae found out afterward, not because Nia hid it, but because she'd simply done it on a Tuesday afternoon while he was in a meeting and told him about it that evening over dinner. "You called her," he said. "Yes." "What did you say?" Nia was quiet for a moment. They were at the kitchen table, not the grand dining room, the kitchen table, which had become the place they ate when it was just the two of them, something that had happened by accident and then by choice. "I told her I wasn't ready to be close to her, that I didn't know if I ever would be, but that I didn't want to spend my life being someone's reason for a family falling apart." A pause. "I told her she needed help, real help, not from me, but from someone." "What did she say?" "She said she knew." Nia looked at him. "She cried. I didn't," which felt strange, but that's where we are. He looked at her across the table. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said, "but I'm not doing it for her. I'm doing it for me. I don't want to carry hate. I'm tired of carrying things that aren't mine." She reached for her water glass. "I have enough of my own." It was the most pragmatic form of grace he had ever witnessed, and it moved through him like something he didn't have an adequate word for. Not admiration, something that included admiration but was larger than it. Something that had to do with the specific quality of a person who manages to remain themselves after everything that has tried to unmake them. His mother called Nia in March. Min-jae was in the house when it happened. He was in his office, Nia was in the sitting room down the hall, and he heard her voice shift in register. Not alarmed, but careful in the specific way of someone who has picked up the phone and found something unexpected on the other end. He did not go to the hallway. He sat in his office and let it happen without his presence in it because it was not his call to manage. It was hers. The call lasted 40 minutes. Afterward, Nia appeared in the doorway of his office. She leaned against the frame. He looked up from his desk. "She didn't explain herself," Nia said. "She didn't defend what she did. She asked how I was sleeping. She asked if the doctors were satisfied with my recovery. She asked if there was anything she could do." A pause. "Then she said she was sorry, and then she said goodbye." He watched Nia's face. "That's not enough," Nia said. "Just so you know, one phone call is not enough for 6 years." "I know. But it's a start," she said. "If she means it, we'll see." He nodded. She pushed off the doorframe and went back down the hall, and he listened to her footsteps and the sound of the sitting room door, and then the quiet of the house in the afternoon. And he sat at his desk and thought about the word start, about what it costs, and what it asks, and what it requires you to admit about where you have been before you can locate where you're trying to go. He was home for dinner that night. He was home for dinner most nights that year. Not all of them. His world remained what it was, with its demands and its distances and its particular category of darkness that Nia had always understood without requiring him to illuminate all of it. But most nights. Enough nights that it became the shape of things, the baseline, the thing that the day organized itself around rather than the exception that had to be made. He measured success differently now, not by territories, not by the network of relationships and debts and obligations that constituted the empire he had built across a decade, not by the number on any account, or the square footage of any property, or the deference of any man in any room when he walked into it. He measured it by the sound of Nia's voice in the kitchen in the morning, by the specific quality of the quiet in their house when it was a chosen quiet rather than a lonely one, by the fact that when he came home late, and she was already asleep, she turned toward him in the dark, without waking, a reflex, a body-level knowing. And that small unconscious motion was the clearest thing in his world. One evening in late spring, he came home to find her in the garden at the back of the property, a garden she had started planning in January and been quietly building with the help of a landscape designer she'd found through one of the mansion's new staff. She was standing at the far end of it, in the low gold light, her back to the house, looking at something she was holding. A small plant, he saw as he got closer, something that had apparently arrived that day, still in its nursery container. She heard him coming and turned around. She was not wearing the careful expression, the managed expression, the one that had smiled at him from video screens in hotel rooms across Asia, while she ate dinner alone and drank tea someone had made wrong and said she was fine. She was just wearing her face. "You're early," she said. "I left early," he said. She looked at him. "How come?" "I wanted to come home." She held his gaze for a moment with that directness that had always looked straight through whatever surface he was presenting to whatever was actually behind it. Then she turned back to the garden and held up the small plant. "It's a camellia," she said. "It takes a few years to bloom. The designer said it needs patience." A pause. "I thought that was fitting." He came to stand beside her. They stood together in the garden in the late spring light, looking at the planted beds and the beginning of something that would take time and would ask things of them and would, eventually, bloom. The feared king of the Korean underworld stood in his garden next to his wife and felt, for the first time in the long memory of his adult life, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the world was clean or the past was resolved or the cost of everything had been paid in full, because none of those things were true. The world was not clean. The past was not resolved. Some costs ran longer than a lifetime. But he was here, present in his own life, standing next to the person who had chosen to remain in it after everything that had tried to make remaining impossible, and who was holding a plant that would take years to bloom with the patience of a woman who understood, better than anyone he had ever known, that the most important things never arrive on the schedule you'd prefer. He put his arm around her. She leaned against him. The garden held the light a little longer, the way gardens do in late spring when the days are finally long enough to give you something extra at the end of them. A last hour of warmth, unhurried, belonging to no one's agenda. They stayed until it was gone.